Welcome back to One Piece Explained. It's been a little while since we've had proper manga chapter breakdowns, but we're back on schedule and this chapter has a lot of interesting details. As always, if you've been enjoying my videos, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. And with that said, let's get right into the breakdown of chapter 1093, Luffy vs. Kizaru. Throughout this arc, Kizaru has been pretty serious, especially in contrast to how we've seen him in previous appearances in the manga. Here, he's been ordered to assassinate Vegapunk and combat Sentomaru, two people he's been shown to have a very close relationship with, and he has maintained the serious demeanor even when fighting against Luffy and the crew as well, even to the point of not being affected by the eye-popping qualities of Gear 5th. In the original Japanese text, Kizaru often draws out his words, and this isn't always maintained across various translations. But in this arc, Kizaru has not really been stretching out his delivery, as he's been fairly serious. This is a great inversion of Shabari, where Kizaru was overpowering the crew and keeping up a relaxed casual style, while Luffy couldn't afford to mess around. 2 years later, it's Luffy who is now the playful one, while Kizaru has to maintain his composure, and I love that Luffy even draws out Kizaru's elongated speech when he throws him out of the lab. We learned that Jinbei and Sanji had been sent by Vegapunk to pick up some stuff from second floor building A. Now this was the same place that Robin, Chopper, and Atlas looked through when they were looking for Vegapunk earlier in this arc, and the one thing that we know about this place is that this is where the organoids were being grown. So, perhaps Vegapunk is looking to bring some of these along with him, perhaps to help in healing Stussy, who protected Vegapunk a few chapters ago. Meanwhile, Zoro and Lucci are still fighting outside of the lab, and it looks like Zoro deemed this fight worthy enough to bring out his recently acquired King of Hell three-sword style, as you can tell by the completely black blades and the smoke-like aura around the swords. Now, he wasn't even using this against the Seraphim or even Kaku earlier in this arc, but what's more interesting is that Lucci seems to have finally come around on considering Luffy to be an emperor. If you recall, Lucci was determined to continue their mission without waiting for approval because he didn't see Luffy as an actual emperor. I guess all it really took was just losing to him again. Back with Kizaru, he got thrown absurdly far away, and you can barely even make out the ships surrounding the island. We see him use the Yasakani Sacred Jewel technique, which we first saw used back during the Marineford arc, but he adds a new twist to it this time, with him sending out the little beams of light and then turning himself into light to travel back with them to the island. And from here, the light reforms into holograms of himself. And not only that, these holograms look to be sentient to some extent, as one of them calls out the Ama no Murokumo sword technique, which we first saw used by Kizaru back in Shabari. Now, there has been a theory or idea for a little while now that I'm quite fond of, that states that the awakening of Alogia allows for the creation of sentient beings from that element, and these holograms could definitely be seen as another instance for supporting this theory. Now, if this is your first time hearing of this idea, I'll just quickly run through some of the other instances that we've seen of this. The first time we've seen something like this was with Enel, who was able to create various beasts made of lightning. But not only that, he did this by converting the drums on his back into lightning itself, which definitely feels like the awakened ability to affect your environment with your powers. We would later see something with Akainu during the Marineford arc, where he was able to conjure a hound made of magma. Karasu has also been shown to be able to make crows out of his Soot powers that have some level of sentience, and sometimes they even are able to carry his own consciousness to communicate. And more recently, I've speculated that Prince Groose's Glorp Glorp fruit, which lets him produce and manipulate clay as a clay man, is actually a Logia. We've seen him create clay golems that look like marine soldiers, and we've even seen these golems speak as well as eat real food. Now, this is all just a working theory, of course, but Kizaru's holograms could play into this idea very well. I should note that while I am calling them holograms, they do seem capable of doing tangible damage to Luffy, as we've seen with the sword slashing his cheek. Now, Luffy calls these clones hollows, just like he did with the holograms at the start of this arc. Here, Luffy is conflating the idea of holograms, as explained to him by Jinbei, with the hollows from Perona's fruit that he's encountered back during the Thriller Bark arc. Kizaru using these holograms to fight is really interesting thematically, with Atlas's words from earlier in this arc about whether something is real or not. We were introduced to the light pressure gloves, which lets you interact with holograms, and maybe that'll be useful to combat Kizaru's light clones, which can apparently interact with others, but revert to having the properties of light when being interacted with by Luffy. This is also really interesting to me, as it reminds me of one of the many unanswered questions in this arc, which is what is up with Vegapunk's phasing abilities. Upon his introduction, we saw him phase through the Iron Giant and then get stuck, which he described as a problem with his warping. And a little bit later, he begins to disappear from the lower level of the island and reappears over at the Labo phase, much to everyone's confusion. Now we know that Vegapunk was able to create lasers by studying Kizaru's abilities, so this makes me wonder if he was able to create this tangible hologram technology by researching Kizaru's capabilities as well. Before this chapter, I've long thought it was possible that Vegapunk himself was a hologram, but of course, we've seen countless instances where others have physically interacted with him, even to the extent of affecting him through Devil Fruit powers, such as with Bonney. And to our knowledge, no one was using the light pressure gloves in these instances, so I haven't really been able to support this idea in full. However, with this chapter, we see the potential of holograms that can both exist between tangibility and intangibility without the need of external devices such as the light pressure gloves. This also reminds me a lot of the door to the lab that the Straw Hats walked through at the start of the arc. They were able to simply walk through it as if it wasn't a solid object, but then when they arrived on the other side, the door was tangible again and they couldn't phase through it. Lilith's line here about ignoring your eyes echoes back to Atlas's comments about people believing in things as soon as they can touch them. I'm not necessarily planting my foot on the ground here and saying that I'm convinced that Vegapunk and the lab are holograms, but I do think that this is not that far-fetched of a possibility considering the various pieces of information that we've been provided across this arc. This is just one way of making sense of everything, and I can see some portion of this being applied in some shape or form, and I'm excited to see where the story actually ends up going. When dealing with Kizaru's holograms, Luffy tries a Gum Gum Dawn Whip, a technique debuted earlier in this arc against Lucci. But seeing as this doesn't work, he runs away to try and get all the holograms lined up in pursuit after him so he can turn around and deliver a Gum Gum Dawn stamp. But this doesn't work either, of course, and he realizes that it's him who's been tricked. I love this little back and forth, as earlier I talked about how both Luffy and Kizaru can be silly at times, but this specific instance in particular, with them trying to trick one another, really works well with the idea that these are two characters named or themed after monkeys, an animal that across various folklore tends to be tricky, with Kizaru translating to yellow monkey, and Luffy's surname, of course, being monkey. I also want to point out how this sequence of Luffy delivering a stamp to try and hit the real enemy reminds me a lot of the climax of his fight with Mr. 3 during the Little Garden arc. Mr. 3 had used his Wax mansion to surround Luffy with fake wax clones of himself, whereas here, Kizaru is trying to confuse Luffy with his much stronger, sentient light clones. Luffy was able to figure out the real one due to his instinct back then, but here, there is no real one, or perhaps the holograms are so sentient that they all present as being real. And I just thought this was a really cool parallel. Of course, the real Kizaru was already back at the lab, looking for Vegapunk, who was nowhere to be found. We see him actually holding Usopp up, almost as if he mistook him for a Vegapunk. And I don't think this is actually the case, but it is really funny with the context of Usopp's line from earlier in this arc, joking about how he could be a Vegapunk himself. And if you'd like, you could consider this to be another classic instance of an Usopp lie coming true. When Kizaru finds Vegapunk and tries to blast him with his laser, Luffy intervenes and attempts to eat the beam, literally. And we've seen him try stuff like this before, all the way back against Crocodile Sand, and more recently in Gear 5th against Lucci. Perhaps he was thinking it wouldn't hurt because he tried eating the holograms of food at the start of the arc, but as it turns out, lasers are really hot. And I do think it's really interesting though how the light radiates from Luffy here, as he has his iconic pose with his limbs stretched out, and the light surrounding him really does remind me of the sun, with him being the sun god and all. There's definitely something going on here as a subplot with the Vegapunks looking to create a sun and the need for an energy source, along with Luffy being the sun god and the Iron Giant seemingly activating in the last chapter. I won't go too much into speculation mode here, but I just found this depiction of Luffy to be really interesting. Vegapunk and Atlas, along with Sanji and Frankie eventually, race down to the Fabrio phase in the Vega Tank 8. Now, this looks to be a combination of the bubble technology that was introduced previously in the arc, along with wheels that may actually be made of the island clouds that he was able to recreate. This is just my guess, of course, but none of this has been confirmed. If it is true, though, it seems to be pretty durable, and lives up to the name of it being a tank. He's on his way down because he's concerned for Bonney. Now, across the fandom, there seems to be a big question about whether Bonney's true age is that of a child or not, and it's felt fairly controversial. As weird as it may be with how she's been depicted across the series, there is some amount of evidence that could support the idea that she is a child. Firstly, her true age was undisclosed during the Volume 68 SBS when all of the supernovas had their ages revealed. There's also the notion that she is very emotional and refers to Kuma as her daddy in the way a young child would. When she first appeared in this arc, she was found in the ocean in the form of a child, leading many to think that she was unable to maintain her devil fruit powers and thus reverted to her potential true age. And what a lot of people have been using in this arc as potential evidence is the numerous references to Bonney as being a little girl or a girl from people like Saturn or Vegapunk. There's also the line from this chapter of Vegapunk calling out Frankie for not helping Bonney despite being a grown man. Now, it should be noted that Vegapunk and Saturn are fairly older people themselves, so it's not unusual for them to refer to people much younger than them like this, but I think this ambiguity is also intentional. This is also the first time that we've seen Sentomaru express any real concern for Bonney, which is interesting. While I do think it's unfortunately possible for Bonney to be revealed as a child, I think it's a little bit more interesting if it's actually revealed that she's a clone. This would allow her to be technically a couple of years old because she was cloned some numbers of years ago, which may allow certain timelines to line up with Kuma, but we've seen that clones can grow and mature into adulthood faster than regular humans, as seen with Germa's clones. Also, the chapter that we first learned that Stussy was actually a clone started off with a journal entry from Vegapunk talking about a certain someone being a real person. With the context of the chapter, it makes the reader think that it's referring to Stussy, but there's a non-zero chance that it's actually talking about Bonney as well, with how it's framed on the first page of the chapter. Of course, this is just one possibility, and I just hope that whatever happens isn't too weird or controversial. The chapter ends with Atlas giving an order to take out all of the Marines, which of course doesn't include the world government agents, nor does it include Saturn, who is nearby. Earlier in the chapter, the Vegapunks expressed how they were the highest authority on the island because, of course, they had no clue that Saturn is around, so it'll be good to see this point of tension finally come to fruition. And that's about it for all the big things that I want to talk about in this chapter. There was a lot more than I thought there'd be, but I love when we get chapters like this that just shed just enough light on a bunch of things to allow us to speculate and theorize like crazy. If you've enjoyed this breakdown, and if you've been enjoying my videos in general, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribed. I do weekly chapter breakdowns here, and I still have some live action videos in store. There's also some deep dives on a few topics from the manga that I've been wanting to do for a while that should be up in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for your support, thank you for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.